Finally, happy days are here again. On August 1st, Game Freak announced what the rules for the new competitive Pokemon format were going to be for the rest of 2024. And while a lot of us thought that for sure, the Pokemon Company would do the natural thing after a format with one restricted, and let us play with two restricteds at a time, mixing and matching our Calyrexes with Groudons, Kyogres, and Miraidons, we got something way cooler. Legendary Pokemon are banned. Game Freak killed them all, not just the Calyrexes, but the Urshifus, and the Fluttermanes too. Every Pokemon that is categorized as legendary, such as box art legendaries like Kyogre, sub-legendaries like Zapdos, Urshifu, and Ogerpon, and all the Paradox Pokemon, starting in September, are not legal for competitive play. Meaning, the only Pokemon that are going to be legal for this format are just regular old Pokemon. Nothing with weird special privileges of getting insane stats or broken abilities, at least not on purpose. For the most part, just funny little guys that you could play with in your regular playthrough of the game. So that means it's time for you, yes you, Tim from New Jersey, who I know is watching this video, to boot up Scarlet and Violet and build your broken Ariados team, right? Well, slow down. Some Pokemon are still better than others, but yeah, suddenly a lot more Pokemon are viable. So today, let's take a look at how removing so many busted Pokemon from the format could impact what we'll be doing for the rest of the year, and answer the question of if it's gonna be all that we're hyping it up to be. And maybe learn something about Pokemon metagames along the way. Obviously, removing restricted Pokemon like Calyrex and Kyogre are a big deal, but we've only had them around for a little while, so I'm not gonna spend too much time dealing with them today. Instead, I'm gonna focus on Pokemon that have been completely defining the format from the first time they've been legal. Let's start with one of the more obvious ones, Urshifu Rapid Strike. Urshifu is a Pokemon that fundamentally changes the way competitive play works, ignoring what was otherwise one of the only ways to slow down a game and take time to observe what your opponent is going to do and stall stuff out. I'm not gonna go into crazy detail about Urshifu here, watch one of my other 15 videos at this point where I talk about him more generally, but specifically in this context, the presence of a Pokemon that can punch through Protect drastically changes the way that players need to act defensively, and the way they need to think about their defensive tools. Take, for example, Kingambit, a Pokemon that is 4 times weak to fighting and used to absolutely love going for Terra Dark, Black Glasses, boosted Sucker Punches, and Kowtow Cleaves. Once Urshifu got nice and established in the format, it became exponentially harder to play Terra Dark Kingambit, because even with Protect, you would be threatened by Urshifu's super effective close combat. As a result, Kingambit from there on almost exclusively saw success in conjunction with some kind of anti-Urshifu Pokemon, like Rocky Helmet Amoonguss. Urshifu not only invalidates Protect, but funnily enough, restricts what Terras can get away with, because without Protect to rely on, if you're weak to one of Urshifu's stabs, you need a way to be able to take that hit on the chin, or your mon will go away. So the few Kingambits we have seen since have had to rely on more defensive Terra types like Dragon. So in a more abstract sense, Urshifu warped team building and completely changed the tempo of the game. Without this guy around, you'll only have to worry about your Protect not working if your opponent has Feint, a move that is really only common in restricted formats, or, I don't know, your opponent has a Dunsparce. But if you lose to one of those, I really don't have much pity for you. This was the first bullet point behind Urshifu, but honestly, there's another one here too. Urshifu also just really centralized what water types would be viable in VGC. Unless you had a really specific reason, like countering Urshifu with Freeze Drive from Iron Bundle, or with Water Absorb from Wellspring Ogerpon, or if you were running a really specific strategy like Dondozo Tatsugiri, there was basically no room for other water types to do well while Urshifu was around. With him out of the picture, there was actually a whole slew of Pokemon that could take the spot as your water type attacker. The obvious one is Palafin, since he's the water type attacker whose job Urshifu stole, but since the DLCs have come out, there's a whole bunch of water types that are interesting and historically strong that just have not gotten the chance to see any amount of play. For example, Primarina, a strong water type special attacker, Araquanid, a slow bulky physical attacker, and Basculegion, a really cool swift swimmer that I have been dying to try, but he's just never really been a better option than Urshifu, and he's never existed in a format without him. The exciting thing is that all of these Pokemon are objectively pretty freaking good, and they don't really do the same things. They're kinda all existing in their own space. It'll be a lot of fun to experiment with them and see, what type of team each one wants to be on. We're not gonna reach a point in the format where we say, oh, well, yeah, like Araquanid's fine, but why aren't you playing Primarina? Because they aren't that similar, and none of them are significantly stronger than the others. Somewhat similarly, Iron Hands, as a Paradox Pokemon, will not be legal anymore. So our two best fighting types, Iron Hands and Urshifu, are suddenly gone. And there's, frankly, not a lot of good fighting types left. I suspect Annihilate will be pretty strong, since it lines up really well into Incineroar, thanks to its ability to find giving it an attack boost when it's intimidated. But besides that, Pokemon like Gallade or maybe Hariyama might show up. They probably will, but those Pokemon want really specific styles of teams to be good. You can't just slap them on a team. From here, I'm gonna segue from talking about specific Pokemon being removed to specifically the removal of all the Paradox Pokemon. And frankly, I've learned that I kind of absolutely hate these Pokemon. While there are times where the Paradox Pokemon are used as synergy Pokemon, like on Sun teams or with Gravity Sandy Shocks with the Spathra, 99.99999% of the time, they're basically just stat sticks. Like, look at Fluttermane. While this Pokemon has been legal, there's been basically no reason to use any other fairy type, unless they have some kind of weird specific niche like Hatterene. Iron Hands did the same thing for fighting types, again, except for, niche uses like Galit or whatever, until Urshifu came along. Even when they're not like completely usurping entire types of Pokemon as a strictly best version of them, they're warping the format in other ways too. The big one is just speed tiers. In Regulation A, the first format of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the fastest Pokemon was Electrode, who was a fringe Pokemon at best. Its stats are mediocre to say the least, besides its speed. And after that, it was Dragapult, a decent Pokemon for sure, but with how frail it is, he's never going to completely take over a format, at least without some kind of, external force to help him, the way Dynamax did in Sword and Shield. Compare that to the future Paradox Pokemon Iron Bundle and the past Paradox Pokemon Fluttermane. With their base 136 and 135 speed stats respectively, they're fast. They're pretty fast. And they're strong, and in some respects, a little bulky. But neither of these Pokemon are actually faster than Electrode or Dragapult, so how are they warping things? Well, they can be faster for a pretty minimal cost. The Paradox Pokemon get access to the ability Photosynthesis if they're from the past, or Quark Drive if they're from the future. Essentially, these abilities say that if a specific condition is met, sunny weather for past and electric terrain for future, then the Pokemon's highest stat gets increased by either 30%, or if it's their speed stat, then 50%. This can also be triggered by the item Booster Energy for any Paradox Pokemon. I need to emphasize just how strong this is. There are items in the game that do essentially boost a Pokemon's stats, like Assault Vest or the Choice items, but they all come with a pretty big downside. Assault Vest says you can only use attacking moves, and Choice items lock you into only one move at a time, both of which really drastically decrease your flexibility, either in team building or when you're actually playing the game. For Paradox Pokemon, this isn't the case, allowing them to reach absurdly fast speeds or hit extra hard, basically just getting extra stat points without losing almost any flexibility as long as they don't switch out, or as long as they can maintain their desired field effect. The ability to drastically increase a Pokemon's speed, or any stat basically, for pretty close to free, fundamentally changes the way we have to build teams. Suddenly, Pokemon that have been acceptable on a Tailwind team, like say Sylveon, who is normally a medium to slow Pokemon, would basically never be acceptable because they're going to get outsped even in Tailwind by Fluttermane and Iron Bundle. And both these Pokemon have access to Icy Wind, so they'll drop your speed before you can move in Tailwind, so their other fast-ish Pokemon will also go first. Now that paradoxes have been removed, we might start to see more flexibility in what is an acceptable Tailwind sweeper. I, for one, have been trying Blood Moon Ursaluna with Tyranitar in Tailwind, and it has been really good. I've been having fun with it. But, frustratingly, it's not only how fast these Paradox and other legendary Pokemon were that was a problem, it was also that, for some reason, they're all kind of the same speed. Fluttermane, Miraidon, Koraidon, and Chinpao are all base 135 speed stat, making us play this super awkward game of rock, paper, scissors with how we train them. If I want my Chinpao to hit and KO Miraidon with Icicle Crash, I need to make sure I'm fast enough that the Miraidon can't just Volt Switch out of the field before I move. And obviously, the Miraidon player wants the opposite. This incentivizes both of us to run max speed and a boosting speed nature, so Timid for Miraidon and Jolly for Chinpao, turning this extremely common Pokemon matchup into a literal coin flip. This isn't the only weird speed glut either. It's also the case on the other end of the speed spectrum, with Iron Hands, Ursaluna, and Calyrex Ice Rider all having a base speed stat of 50. Lately, Game Freak hasn't only been making a bunch of Pokemon that are really strong, for some reason they've also been giving them exceptionally similar stat distributions, creating this really unfun minigame where each player needs to figure out the perfect balance of making sure their Iron Hands can still take the hits it needs to, and do the damage it needs to, while also guessing at how much speed it needs to outspeed other Iron Hands to help in a mirror match. And when a metagame gets centralized around a few Pokemon, as these restricted and Paradox formats have been, this becomes an even more massive problem. For example, I recently played in a local against the EUIC runner-up, Tim Edwards. We were both playing Calyrex Ice Rider teams. In the first 2 matches, his Calyrex Ice Rider moved before mine literally every time, so I thought that his Calyrex Ice Rider was faster than mine, and set up Trick Room as part of my game plan. Whereas immediately therein, his Calyrex moved before mine. Neither of us knew it, but this whole time our Calyrexes were speed tying. Not a fun experience. Really, as I write this video, I'm realizing that a lot of the problems I've been having with these last few formats aren't issues that have existed to as much of an extent in other restricted formats. Sure, whenever Kyogre and Groudon and all them come out to play, you can't exactly run around playing with your Charger Bug anymore, but there's something more to it this time. It is without a doubt that Game Freak has gotten better about designing Pokemon that they intend to be good in competitive play, and that they're starting to get a semblance of an idea of how to do that without accidentally making things too broken. A weirdly good example of this is Brute Bonnet. Brute Bonnet has Spore, and if there's one thing VGC players love, it's a consistent, fast way to put their opponents to sleep. Game Freak is aware of that and knows it really isn't very fun. So they set up Brute Bonnet's stats so that even if you run a plus speed minus attack nature and 0 attack IVs, you can never get a speed boost with Protosynthesis. This ended up being enough that Brute Bonnet saw basically 0 play over his cousin Amoonguss, but it was close for sure. Game Freak is starting to get good at designing Pokemon that they want to be good. It's obvious that they looked at a Pokemon like Fluttermane and said, we want to push this. There's clearly intentionality in these designs, but the problem is they're getting good at making them generically strong. With the exception of maybe Dondozo and Tatsugiri, every Generation 9 Pokemon that has dominated the metagame has been a Good Stuff's Pokemon. It's just been a generically strong Pokemon that you put on a team of other generically high-statted Pokemon. Back in formats of old, if you were running a Rain team, you would run some hyper-specific Pokemon that you wouldn't basically ever see on any other style of team, like Kingdra and Ludicolo. These days, a Rain team is a generically pretty standard balanced team that throws on a Pelipper at the end to make sure an already powerful water type like Palafin or Urshifu Rapid Strike gets even stronger. And for what it's worth, this isn't really Game Freak's fault. It's hard to make synergy-driven Pokemon. You inherently need to make them weaker on their face so they don't become absurdly broken when they do get to synergize, which makes it, hard to strike that balance of them being, good enough when they have their synergy, but not be broken. This is part of why kind of combo-y decks in trading card games often end up being kind of busted, because it's really hard to, to toe that line. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that I don't want it to happen, and it doesn't mean that Game Freak can stop trying. Game Freak's newfound knowledge of how to make Pokemon specifically for competitive play is a good thing, and I'm excited to see how things will pan out in Generation 10. But for right now, the growing pains of these excessively, generically strong Pokemon can be kind of miserable to deal with, and it gets even worse when the absolutely strongest Pokemon are legal. So for now, I for one am extremely excited for a break from desperately trying to speed creep my opponent's Calyrex Ice Rider with my own, and instead getting to take some time shooting lightning out of a bridge. Let me know how you feel about all this in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.